we just heard at the introduction Ms. Hurley mentioning basically giving a very accurate assessment of Tunisia as basically a hellhole of liberty. To paraphrase what was the accepted standard in the human rights community. Why didn't the world act accordingly? Which is the realpolitik piece of it. And a lot of that realpolitik piece informed the narrative that basically covered the accepted themes and issues of coverage of the Middle East and North Africa. So when Ben Ali stepped down, the world was shocked. They didn't see this coming. You know, Tunisia, moderate. You know, they're on the good side. They're helping with the war and terror. Social media had a major role in shifting and breaking through that narrative, because very much is operated as sort of the X-ray that cut through the accepted narrative, which is chiefly that the Middle East, you want to cover, like everything that is happening there is related to heads of states and then the big geopolitical problems, conflicts. Cover that, you're safe, you've got all the pictures. That's what the Middle East is about. Well, surprise, surprise. And as someone, and Jillian here with me, we've worked on extensive advocacy campaigns, which, by the way, were really the test labs on how to figure out this online-offline switch. Advocacy campaigns for bloggers and online activists who got in trouble with our governments. And what we learned collectively as a community is that how to get, first of all, understand how traditional media works. And that means getting coverage for these people who got in trouble. By the way, oftentimes very few of the people who got arrested at the time for these online activism got actual coverage in mainstream media.
I think it makes sense actually to bring up an example at this point, and I think what you were getting at sort of is one of the core examples that we've dealt with over the past few months is a blogger who's no longer in prison, but as far as we know is in hiding.
Disappeared. We really don't know his status.
Bahraini blogger Ali Abdul Imam, who's a personal friend of ours and whom we've met with on a number of occasions, and who's an activist himself, and I don't even know that he defines himself as an activist. He ran a site called Bahrain Online, and he was arrested last fall and without trial was imprisoned, and we essentially, and I don't say we, I don't want to take credit for this, but Nasser and other folks, and myself included in this, started up an email list where we basically strategized on how to get the media's attention for this case, and ended up actually having quite a bit of success in working, our strategic contacts and things like that. But I think that a lot of this power comes from these sort of homegrown networks that exist throughout the region.
Yeah, and these home networks, the homegrown networks that evolved around this region, had a cement of solidarity that emerged through this year. And interestingly, one of the factors of solidarity was a stated, it wasn't even left unsaid, a stated commitment to support each other, because at the end of the day, mainstream media is that's not where the help's gonna come from. And the interaction really of this is that this is not a love-hate relationship per se. It's a pragmatic relationship. People need certain things done by the different players. What ended up happening is that when, for example, Tunisia blew up, for the first 2 weeks of the uprising, the video footage that was, first of all, it was picked by Jazeera, and then the international news networks started jumping in when they realized that there is a story, real story, was exclusively fed by the Tunisian cyber activist community, who had set up systems to aggregate that. And in that sense, you can see that social media played a role as like an echo chamber, a massive echo chamber, because you had multiple nodes, people who had high counts of followers on Twitter, and who had a lot of, like a big network on Facebook, who leveraged it, systematically building on that cumulative experience. And it was a cross-regional effort. It involves people from the Atlantic, Mauritania, going to the Gulf. And these are networks that emerged in that. But here's the beautiful thing about what happened. We live in a practical world. the mainstream media organization realized that this is a real story and their footage was obviously provided by these people, they started realizing the value here in sort of the outlet that social media become. There was a shift of attitude, whereas social media was finally regarded as a source of information, which is something that was a mini revolution. And there was finally an acknowledgement of the very obvious. When you have tens of thousands and later on in Cairo, 1 million people in the streets trying to bring down Hosni Mubarak, that means that the way we covered the Middle East, and we understood it until this point, is deeply flawed. But in the cycle, ultimately, when Hosni Mubarak, for example, pulled off the plug, and before that in Tunisia, there was also a conscious effort by the cyber activist community leveraging social media to have their end goal customer shifted. It was no longer your fellow tweep or your fellow blogger. Your end goal customer became the producer of the satellite channel. And that way you closed the full loop, like the cycle of online, offline, satellite, bounce back your information, and ultimately use a term, it is something that we've described as weaponizing hashtags, which is very much informational warfare. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good word, weaponizing hashtags. But you said that Al Jazeera was exclusively fed by cyber activist report in Tunisia. That was also the case for France 24 and other main TV networks. But I think we shouldn't forget here that classical media, mainstream media companies also have their own agenda.
Obviously.
Because it's in Syria. It's even worse. The situation is even worse than in Tunisia because no foreign journalist could work inside the country. And on the other hand, there are also many Syrian cyber activists who are trying to report to the world, and they do actually. But we don't see much on Syria, much on Bahrain, much on other countries of the Gulf on Al Jazeera than we have seen on Tunisia. So don't you think that there is also an issue of the agenda related to the specific agenda of these TV networks, but also the agenda, the political agenda of foreign government here? Could you please?
Well, so I'm gonna let Nasser tackle the second part of that question, but I do actually think that there's something really interesting here in putting Syria and Bahrain both in the same category in this sense, which is that both countries also have a very, very strong pro-regime presence online, which in many ways has become propagandized on places like Twitter. And so I'll give you an example. Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times journalist, has been writing a lot about Bahrain, and he's gotten a lot of support from the Bahraini human rights groups. But at the same time, he's also been attacked, given death threats, all on public on Twitter. And these are by Bahrainis who are pro-regime. I will not surmise whether or not they're paid by the government, because I don't think that actually matters. But really, if you use the hashtag Bahrain and you start talking about Bahrain on Twitter, I guarantee that you will eventually be attacked by people yelling at you, calling you names. This has happened to me a number of times, and I've actually had to block about 200 people because of it. But essentially, you've got Bahrain is a country of, what is the population of Bahrain?
700 and some change.
Yeah, so we're talking about less than 1 million people.
The citizens.
Right.
Yeah, the citizens.
Right. And I will say that some of the people are not Bahraini, the ones who attack me, but you've actually got Americans attacking me too. But so essentially what you have is a really, really strong propaganda campaign on Twitter. So you've got 600, 700,000 people in the country. I don't know how many of them are on Twitter, but if 200 of them are attacking Nicholas Kristof, then I imagine that the anti-regime, the opposition on Twitter, is probably not as strong. And so you've got a very skewed narrative narrative, and you've got a hard time, and I don't know the situation of journalists in Bahrain at the moment. I know that it's much more available, much more accessible than Syria, but you've got a real problem there in presenting the story. And Syria actually has the same thing, where early on we did a little bit of investigative work and found that there was a Bahraini company that was being used by a pro-regime, Syrian pro-regime advocate to spam the Syria hashtag on Twitter. And what he was doing was he would use photographs, and he was using some of my photographs, which is how I came across this, my photographs of Syria. He would use photographs of beautiful landscapes or food in Syria, and he would tweet up to 10 times a minute on the Syria hashtag using various accounts to try to flood any information that was coming out of the country from activists. And so Twitter, to their credit, eventually removed him from search, but obviously they're not going to remove him, and I don't think that they should remove his accounts entirely necessarily. It's a tricky question. But they did remove him from the search results, as this was clearly spam. And so, you do have a very strong pro-regime narrative online, and I don't know, it's hard to say to what degree it's genuine and to what degree it's not, but I do think that that also skews the media portrayal, especially when they're relying on social media as they are in Syria.
Interesting that you had to block 200 people because the Bahrainis gave up on me. They don't attack as much as they do you. And in terms of the second part of your question, Meryem, in terms of the agendas, yeah, of course they do. Media organizations, nation states, all have their agendas. And one of the biggest debates in the growth of the cyber activist community, and is still an ongoing debate, I personally, through the work of my organization and also through past experiences, because before that I was an anti-slavery activist in Mauritania and had, a dissident career there. And the conclusion that I have reached, so what? Let them have all their agendas. There is basically this entrepreneurial spirit where make do with what you have. Now, in terms of the agenda itself, yes, there was a tendency in the coverage of. You will see a lot of, for example, like when human rights abuses occur in Iran, you'll see rightfully, and I very much support that, a lot of coverage on the basis, and that's how it should be. But when Bahrain, for example, and I think that's what, by the way, one of the scandals of this period that we live in, is that forget Western media. It's too easy of a target to punch right now. Arab media, where the landscape is basically skewed into these two polarization. A lot of people talk about Al Jazeera. Yes, they're a huge player and they have a huge part of the market share, but only in the broadcast.
Yeah.